not to be confused with sound issues, such as in the plenary. So I broke the number one rule, which is when you're organizing a conference, never give a talk. So I will take my fractured brain, channel it, and share with you the results of a project that I worked on with Carolee Roquebaum, who may be in the room here, with the Washington State Department of Transportation, and Amy Shatskin at Sound Transit. We were a team working together on this project. So who is, or what is Sound Transit? Sound Transit is a region-wide, Central Puget Sound region-wide rapid transit public transit organization that serves essentially the metro areas between Tacoma, Seattle, and Everett. I have their network map up here. This is, of course, a lot of space that is condensed into a small map, so there are a lot of details on there. But the key thing about Sound Transit is they have three different modes. They have a heavy rail line that runs along that with that green line, if you can see that as it snakes through, that serves Everett to Tacoma. They have bus rapid transit that primarily uses the interstate system plus some other arterials and some other secondary surface streets, but largely relying on the interstate system. And then also the Link Light Rail system, which some of you may have ridden in if you flew into town and came in on the airport. That's the newest part of their system that's been rapidly expanding. Is actually, you can see some of the construction happening right here in the U District. If you're over on the Ave and you notice some of the streets closed off, that is one of the link stations that's going in. All the construction down by the stadium is also link system coming in. So that's a rapidly expanding part of their system that is in service in many parts of the city already. 28 million riders and rapidly growing. Ridership is continuing to go up. And also, something that was important in this project is recognizing that Sound Transit is not necessarily the sole owner and operator of all of their modes. So they work in contractual partnerships with groups like, or companies like BNSF, which owns the heavy rail line that's used by the Sounder system, with King County Metro, Pierce Transit, Community Transit, and Amtrak. So it is very much a combination of infrastructure that they own, but also a lot of partnerships where they're essentially contracting with these other service providers under the name of Sound Transit. So the Sound Transit Climate Change Risk Reduction Project was a pilot project that was funded by the Federal Transit Agency, the Federal Transit Administration, one of 7 pilot projects that all wrapped up by December of 2013. And as far as I know, the final reports from all of these projects were supposed to have been released in July or August. It has been a long time waiting. We turned our project in September of 2013, so this brought entirely new meaning to hurry up and wait, because of course there is always the flurry to get a project done, and we are still waiting for the official release of these products. But it was a really neat pilot project effort that brought in a wide range of federal or of public transit agencies from and projects. So some of these projects focused in on very defined areas, such as a several mile long segment of transit rail line in Philadelphia, to something as large as that consortium, the Galveston, and it was kind of a Florida to Alabama, Florida to Texas, kind of a consortium of transit agencies that were looking at an 1,800-mile broader service area. So very different set of projects. Ours was one of those. And what was important about our project, from my perspective, is that it was this partnership between the Climate Impacts Group, WashDOT, and Sound Transit. And this was also the first time that Sound Transit had started looking at this question of climate impacts. They are a very new organization. They started their bus service in the mid-90s. The Sounder line started running around 2000. And the Link Light Rail opened up in 2009. In fact, the same week that we had the 103.5-degree temperature that John was mentioning earlier. So that was kind of a nice week to start a new system. So the objectives of the project were to take this first look, this across-the-board look at how climate change may affect Sound Transit. And what was interesting, as I mentioned, it's a new agency. So there wasn't a long institutional history to look at how climate affects the agency. So, consider, in contrast, Chicago Transit Authority, which was another pilot project that's been operating for over 100 years. They had a lot of history to look back on and see how different types of weather and climate events have affected their system. So that was, to some degree, a little bit of a challenge in trying to draw on that institutional knowledge. At the same time, however, because the system is so new, they're not really dealing with a lot of institutional legacies or a lot of built-in past engineering standards that have essentially locked in certain vulnerabilities. However, you will see there are still definitely some issues that have to do with past decisions. So the goal was to do this across-the-board assessment of how climate affects the system, where the vulnerabilities might be, looking at operations, physical assets, and then long-term planning. Also to identify some initial adaptation strategies and to take that next step and look at where those adaptation strategies or thinking about adaptation might be integrated into sound transit processes. And then another objective, kind of more in the background, was to take the approach that WashDOT had used in doing their statewide assessment and essentially bring it to the scale of something like sound transit to see how the approach that WashDOT had taken works at a smaller scale. So we've heard a lot about climate impacts. I just wanted to highlight here what were the impacts that were of particular interest to sound transit. At a very high level, of course, increasing average temperatures, both winter and summer, which have pros and cons in both cases, and more extreme heat events. Rail, for example, is very sensitive, or can be sensitive, depending on the type of rail, to temperatures above certain thresholds, depending on how that rail is engineered. For example, overhead catenary wires will sag as temperatures increase. So there are all kinds of interesting operational issues that come into effect depending on how the system is engineered, even at relatively moderate temperatures. And then increasing winter precipitation and more extreme precipitation events were clearly something that they were interested in. The increasing flood risk west of the Cascades. There are a number of areas where they have services that are in or cross floodplains or could otherwise be affected both directly and indirectly by flooding. And then rising sea level, which is primarily an issue for the North Sounder line, which, if you may recall, there's the green line that was hugging in the Puget Sound, and that's that North Sounder line. So the question, of course, is what do these changes mean for sound transit? And specifically, we were looking at these 5 things: the Sounder line, the heavy rail line, Link Light Rail, Sound Transit Express. But then Sound Transit also owns and operates a lot of facilities. So the stations that customers are using to access services, and then they also have an environmental mitigation program that is part of their construction. So the question was then also, how would climate change affect those? So I'll start with the overarching findings and considerations, and just want to note that there, of course, is lots of detail in the report, which should be posted any day. So I would encourage you, if you're curious or interested in more details, to check the report. So the very high level, climate change exacerbates many of the existing issues already facing sound transit. And this is a very common finding. In many cases, we already have problems, fill in the blank, depending, it doesn't really matter what your system is, whether you're talking about a wastewater system or, something like sound transit. There are places where, for example, stormwater management is a challenge. And the projections for more extreme precipitation exacerbates those existing challenges and means that will be either more of an issue where it is already a problem or could emerge as a new issue in areas where you may not have stormwater problems now but are kind of in effect right on that threshold. The probability and the timing and the degree to which these impacts could affect sound transit will depend on many factors. So one of the things that we really investigated here were these thresholds at which point impacts really started to matter. And a good example is related to landslides, which I'll show you later. And of course, another example is sea level rise. You can have 13 inches of sea level rise, and there will be potentially some impacts, and then you get to 14 inches of sea level rise, and then suddenly you now have things that are underwater. So there are these thresholds. And that also that most of the impacts we found on sound transit were minor to moderate. And so this is one of those cases where Oftentimes I think people are afraid to ask this question because the assumption is that everything will be bad and we're going to have to do everything differently. And what we found with Sound Transit is they're actually in pretty good shape in many areas, and that our analysis really helped provide some focus on some areas that they would want to look at moving forward in time. And there are significant impacts that are possible depending on how much change we see and how rapidly it changes. And then finally, that Sound Transit does possess a good degree of climate resilience already, partially because the system is so new and is designed to the latest engineering standards, partially a function of where they happen to put the lines, and also because of other engineering decisions that they've made. And also they have a good capacity to address climate impacts. So I will just quickly mention the project approach. I'll just bring all these up. So as I mentioned, we modeled ours after an approach that WashDOT used for their state assessment, and we drew on existing research for information on the climate change impacts, developed a white paper that provided essentially the foundational information for all of the participants, all the people who were involved in different workshops. We had an advisory group that consisted of Sound Transit staff and their either executive managers or other managers who needed to be part of the process and who were really important for helping us get the right people to the workshops that we had planned as part of this process. We did a staff survey broadly across the agency to try to get more information to get as much information as we could from people who may not be at the workshops, but who could provide some context in terms of observed observations that they have of how the system works with different types of climate events, extreme weather events, and then also to get their perceptions about climate impacts and what they think may be important to Sound Transit. And then we had about 12 facilitated workshops over the course of a year that first looked at the vulnerability assessment, or looked at assessing the vulnerability in the different modes and the facilities and environmental management. And then also in the next wave of workshops, we looked at the adaptation strategies, and then ultimately through a lot of meetings, small group meetings with senior staff, we were able to look at what the potential adaptation pathways might be and kind of tailor the questions that you might want to ask for different management responsibilities and program areas within the organization. So when you take the climate impacts and you have this conversation with folks who are working in Sound Transit, and we had at our workshops, for example, for the Sounder workshop, we had anywhere from senior managers to the technical staff who are involved with the day-to-day operations of Sound Transit, and repeat across all the different modes. You come up with quite a laundry list of impacts, and we broke them out into essentially the main drivers. So with temperature and the projected increases in temperature, we have increased potential for the things on the left-hand column, rail buckling, heat stress, et cetera. For precipitation, you get the impacts that are in the middle column, and finally for sea level rise, we identified these impacts. But great, but what's important? This is often where some reports stop, but we wanted to drill down further and try to get a better prioritization. So the question was, what impacts actually mattered the most across all services, and then which services might become higher priorities. So we essentially did this prioritization by looking at things like impacts to service delivery. I mean, this is a service organization, so trip cancellations really matter. So we looked at service delivery, the geographic distribution of the impact, the potential costs. We were just looking at that from a qualitative standpoint. We didn't actually try to quantify anything. And the probability of an impact. Again, this was not quite a formal criteria, but was still used to help aid decision-making. So when we run our different filters through, we wound up with this kind of tiered response for which impacts matter more, with the most important and potentially significant impacts associated with increased mudslide activity and sea level rise. And then going to the far right, we have the potentially minor impacts. So this kind of helped to take that, this long list and start reshuffling it and filtering it. The next question, of course, is which services may become higher adaptation priorities, and I'll just bring those up. And again, we had these, high, medium, and low adaptation priorities, all contingent, of course, on how climate impacts evolve over time. But this is where we saw, for example, that North Sounder, of all the services, North Sounder is a service, part of their service that may become a higher adaptation priority, primarily because of the sea level rise issue. And then the Edmonds and Mukilteo sounder stations, which are part of that north line, also would become higher priorities given sea level rise. If we see, for example, 50 inches or more of sea level rise, and in the case of mudslides, which are also a factor for the north sounder line, if we see mudslides occurring on the order of 70 or more trip cancellations a year. So there are thresholds here at which kind of define these responses, and I think that's really important to remember. It's not if we get one mudslide on the north sounder line, it's if they really get, many that cause 70 or more trip cancellations. Again, those are part of the nuances that are in the report. So one of the things that we found, of course, is that Sound Transit has many options for adaptation. These are very familiar. These are broad categories. We identified over 70 adaptation options. These are kind of the broader headings under which they could be grouped, and are part of the common conversation with adaptation. And then finally, we also identified that there are many opportunities for integrating this information. So in the case of Sound Transit, it's a large organization. It's still expanding its system. There are opportunities in the policy setting that it does, internal policy setting, its environmental review process, its strategic system planning, its preliminary engineering, and so on. And what we did is we actually tailored, we tried to identify what questions should you be asking if you are in the environmental review stage versus if you're in intergovernmental relations, what are the kind of questions you might want to be asking to help ensure that adaptation is getting integrated. So my time is up. I want to just close with the acknowledgements and thank yous. We could not have done this without Sound Transit's buy-in and the strong support of their management. And without Amy Shatskin and Carolee Roquebaum, this would have certainly not gotten done and would not have been nearly as enjoyable to work on. So I want to thank them for being such great project partners. Thank you.
Questions for Lara?
I noticed in your presentation you didn't really address snow. Is that given a lot of planning since kind of more blizzard events are anticipated?
So we don't have good projections about the cold weather outbreaks that might lead to heavy snow in the region. Snow is certainly a factor, and for them is their bigger factor right now in terms of the kinds of things that could affect service disruptions within the city. So that was certainly a recognized issue. However, we just didn't have any projections on that, and in general, we're expecting that we would see less snow going into the future, recognizing that we will still get cold air outbreaks. We will still get heavy snow events in the future. It's just that with warming winter temperatures, we expect those to be less frequent. But it was primarily a factor of primarily based on the fact that we didn't have, we don't have projections of how those cold air outbreaks may change and whether we would expect to see a change in the number of lowland snow events that actually impact service. The red shirt?
Yes.
Sorry.
This North Sounder line had a lot of slides this last winter, and I'm sure more than met the 70.
Yes.
I was wondering what the proposed options were for mitigation for that one.
So we had the workshop for Sounder on October 31st, 2012, and at that point, their worst year for trip interruptions were 70 trip interruptions, which is not 70 slides, but just the number of times that Sounder's service is canceled. That winter, there were 225 trip cancellations, and it kind of blew everybody's mind that it was a complete anomaly. So, but this is where the ownership issue really becomes part of the conversation because Sound Transit doesn't own the line. BNSF owns the line. So Sound Transit is already, of course, working closely with BNSF on a number of issues. And in response to that particular winter and all the cancellations, there was some federal support provided on the order of maybe $13 or $15 million to try to armor or at least deal with the slide risk in some of the most troublesome spots. And so Sound Transit was working with BNSF on that. And so in terms of the long-term conversation about how to address any future risk, that is something that Sound Transit would be working with BNSF on. But since BNSF is the rail line owner, those decisions ultimately rest with BNSF. So we've had executive team briefings, and we've had staff briefings, and people have been very interested. Sound Transit is moving forward with their adaptation work as they're working with a consulting firm, and they're going to now try to start to sort and prioritize the 70 different adaptation options, looking at, of course, what are the priority service areas and the priority impacts, but then taking into account some of the things that John mentioned, such as, where are those windows of opportunity? Because, for example, the system is being expanded up to Linwood. That is certainly going to be a time that you want to work in some adaptive decisions before things get set in concrete. So it was good. We had good support. It definitely took some time to get this on people's schedules. That was probably the biggest challenge, was just getting the right mix of folks in the same room for the same 3-hour time block. But otherwise, very good support.
I think we'll move on. Thanks again, Lara.